Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for the difference between inherent and residual vendor risk webinar. My name is Jessie Redmond, and I will be your host. On your screen, you should see multiple widgets that you can use, including Ask Question, Media Player, Slides, Related Content, Speaker Bio, Request Demo, and Help. If you are unfamiliar with our webinars, all the widget boxes are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to maximize your screen space. At the bottom of your screen in the toolbar are icon buttons you can use to show and hide the widget. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right corner of that widget. If you experience any issues or have technical questions, you can use the Help widget or submit them along with any other questions through the Ask Question widget. Don't worry, we do capture all questions throughout the session. We will answer some during the webcast, but those that we do not have a chance to answer live, we will address with you via email. Today's live session is eligible for 1 CPE credit. If you wish to receive this credit, please remember to be logged in individually with your own credentials, answer all 3 polling questions that appear on your screen during today's presentation, be in attendance for the entire live 1-hour session, and complete the follow-up survey. We'll send the link to the follow-up survey 24 hours after the live session. If you meet all requirements, we'll send your CPE certificate within 7 to 10 business days following survey submission. With us today, we have Kelly Vick, VendMinder's president. Today, Kelly will discuss what inherent and residual risks are, how to determine them, and how they are applied in third-party risk management. You will see a link to a copy of today's slide deck, a link to our website, a link to our samples library, links to our 6 steps of an inherent risk assessment on vendors infographic and sample questionnaire, the process of inherent to residual vendor risk infographics, what are inherent and residual third-party risk ebooks, as well as a link to our library of additional resources, all within the related content widget. With all that being said, I'd like to hand it over to Kelly. Kelly, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jessie. And yeah, let's just jump right into the agenda today. We're going to talk about, as Jessie said, the difference between inherent and residual vendor risk. Then we'll talk through determining inherent risk and the role of due diligence in this process, and then how to properly apply the residual risk. And we'll talk through the standard or best practice risk handling techniques. And then, of course, we always end with some key takeaways. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. What is risk? This is a really great place to start. So as a definition, risk is exposing someone or something of value to harm, danger, or loss. So when talking about the vendor or third-party risk, there are 2 types of risk to be considered. The first is inherent risk. This is the risk that exists just because of the type of service they are providing, just because of the access to the data that you are sharing with them. Inherent risk exists before anyone can do anything to lessen that risk. They are natural. Typically, inherent risk is measured as high, medium, or low, or some variations of those labels. On the other hand, residual risk is what remains after you have done something about the level of risk you identified as the inherent risk, after you have applied some controls to those risks. Residual risk would therefore never be higher than inherent risk. It could be the same if you don't have enough controls to reduce the risk, but it would never be higher. Hopefully, the vendor and you have some solid controls in place, though, that will allow you to result into a lower residual risk. That is the goal in that process, and we're going to talk more about that as we go along. Let's focus on inherent risk for a moment. Again, this risk exists naturally based on what the vendor is doing for you, what they have access to, who they work with, and therefore what happens to your data to which they have access. Inherent risk also is what is used to determine your scope and level of due diligence that you should be performing on that vendor. And by that I mean, how much review are you going to do on that vendor? What documented controls will you want to see and analyze? And who on your team will need to be a part of that process? And lastly, the inherent risk also determines, or should determine, the frequency with which you should perform ongoing monitoring to include reviewing the due diligence and assessing the vendor's controls on a regular basis. What you see here is that many risks can overlap each other. We just gave you a couple of examples. ESG risk and reputation risk, those are pretty close aligned, as is financial risk and cybersecurity risk. Each risk, though, must be assessed independently so that you do have a full understanding of all risk types and levels. Your assessments will require different subject matter experts also based on those risk domains. It's unlikely that your chief financial officer has the knowledge to do an operational risk because they're just not in the deep throes of the operations of the business. So you need to make sure you have the SMEs aligned, and different controls are definitely needed also for each of these risk types. So it's important that these risk domains all be evaluated independently. So you need to determine how you're going to measure or quantify the inherent risk of your vendor. And here's three various methodologies to consider using. One is a subjective evaluation or a best guess. Another is a point system where you tally questions and set a threshold. And the third is the same system, point system, but with weighted questions. So you're going to assign weights to higher risk questions. The weighted questions one is certainly the most comprehensive one of the three, and one that should provide a good, fair, inherent risk assessment of the vendor. Some additional factors to consider in determining how to quantify it is, again, knowing what your organization's risk appetite is, your resources that you're going to use, the personnel and their expertise in determining the inherent risk, and then available applications. Are you doing this in Excel, SharePoint, Access? Do you have some type of software or specific third-party risk management software? So up to this point, we've conducted an inherent risk rating. Now we're going to talk about how we get from there to determining the residual vendor risk. So we first need to take a look at the inherent risk of the vendor, and that's the level of risk before any action is taken to manage it. In most cases, you're not going to just accept the risk at that point. To take a look at the mitigating controls that are in place to reduce that risk. Some of these controls could be systematically reducing the risk by applying certain controls, or there could be other manual processes that are in place to do that. The result after all of that, those controls are applied, is then the calculated residual risk. And this is the risk that remains after those controls have been implemented and the considered effectiveness of those controls are applied. So your organization needs to determine if that remaining residual risk is within your company's or organization's risk appetite to move forward with that vendor. So hopefully that visual helps tell that story. Continuing on about getting from inherent risk to residual risk, what I want to point out here is most important, and that is this should always be done prior to bringing on a new vendor or purchasing a new product. This should be a step that is done in the onboarding or the vetting process of that vendor. I will say it's easy to skip this step. Usually whoever is coming in with this desired product or a new vendor, is just there's a need for it, a desire for it to get in place quickly, and unless you have a very solid process in place, this step can be skipped. It's certainly not a best practice because the inherent risk you know, again, needs to be determined to identify all the risks that are associated with this vendor. And if I haven't said it enough already, remember that every product and every vendor has some inherent risk. It is a natural part of doing business. So continuing on here, as I said, you're going to be looking at the controls of the vendor to mitigate those controls to help reduce the risk. And again, although you can't eliminate all of the inherent risks, you can lessen the likelihood or the occurrence or the severity of those inherent risks by identifying and implementing some controls. And some controls include ensuring that that vendor has the most the best practice and what you expect as far as data encryption goes with your data, that you review and evaluate on an ongoing basis their network penetration testing. Maybe you're looking at employee background checks and compliance training to make sure that you're going to be serviced by the appropriate level of individuals, and then adding some right to audit clauses. These are just a few. This is certainly not an entire list of the controls that you would review, but this is just to give you an example. So to wind it down here before our first poll question, let's talk about calculating that residual risk. And again, to determine that residual risk, you've got to complete that due diligence. You've got to get those various documents and information from your vendor, such as SOC reports, financial statements, etc. And you are going to review those to evaluate that vendor's risk management practices and their controls to determine, again, if they or you can sufficiently mitigate what you know to be the inherent risks with this vendor. So the inherent risks plus their controls result in the residual risk. And this is where you're going to determine, is that residual risk acceptable, tied back to the risk appetite of your organization. So it is a complete circle looking at the inherent natural risk of the vendor, the controls that they have in place, and whether you can live with the resulting risk, and does it align with your company or your organization's risk appetite. So with that, let's take it to our first poll question.
And this brings us to the first poll question of the day. You should see the poll question now in the slides area. If you have any issues, please feel free to send us a message using the Ask Question widget, and we will be happy to assist. As a reminder, if you wish to receive the CPE credit for today's session, you must answer all poll questions and be in attendance for the entire live session. This poll is, how does your organization determine the vendor's inherent risk? A best guess based on services and no real quantification, a points or tally system or other homegrown methods such as Excel, a methodology unique to a software application, other or not sure. Kelly, we have some time now to answer a question from the audience. And this question is, how do large corporations manage their huge list of vendors? This is in relation to risk, for example. Are third-party teams bigger and split to support different types of vendors?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And of course, we work with all sizes of customers. So I think what we see in general is that most large corporations or organizations do assign specific vendors to each vendor. That should be done really in any size organization. But those vendor owners then have the responsibility of the ongoing monitoring and daily tasks around third-party risk management, including risk assessment. So if there is generally one person who's responsible, like the third-party risk manager, who might oversee the processes overall in an organization, then they would need to bring in some collaborators across the organization to assist with that, because in most cases, not one person is going to have all of the knowledge, skill set, and experience in every single risk domain to be able to manage that process for every vendor. So regardless, really, if it's a large organization or a small organization, it should be a collaborative process across the appropriate skill sets of team members.
Thanks everyone for answering that poll question. Here are the results. By the way, you may have noticed reactions such as a thumbs up or heart coming across the screen. If you find this feature distracting, you can turn it off by clicking the 4 arrows in the top right-hand corner of the slides widget, which will expand the slides to full screen and no longer show the reactions. Before moving on, as a quick reminder, in the related content widget, you'll find the process of inherent to residual vendor risk infographic. This is a great resource to grab that covers the process. Kelly, let's continue with the presentation.
Over the next several slides, we're going to talk about steps to completing an inherent risk process. So we're trying to follow through the flow of the inherent risk assessment. And the first step in that is to understand who the vendor owner is. So identify that vendor owner, and that vendor owner would typically have in-depth knowledge of the product and work with that vendor in product on a day-to-day basis. And then they need to understand that their responsibility as the vendor owner is to ensure that this inherent risk assessment is done on an initial basis and then on a routine basis based on the findings from that inherent risk. And because they are the vendor owner of that vendor or product or products, you want to make sure that they understand their responsibility in completing the inherent risk questionnaire and that a deadline is assigned with that. So you probably want to consider evaluating or developing, not evaluating, a standardized inherent risk questionnaire, maybe with some unique prompts that are specific, again, to your established third-party risk management program. So that all needs to align back to the policy and program you've established. And this questionnaire will be a valuable tool that can be used consistently by different vendor owners throughout your organization. So although you may have a couple of inherent risk questionnaires to choose from, but they should be standardized across your organization. So we know who our vendor risk owner is, and we know that we've pulled together a questionnaire. We know we need to pull together a questionnaire, and we're going to generally include all of the risk domains on that questionnaire, but there are some that may not be considered depending on, or included rather, depending on what the vendor provides for you, what that product is. But certainly your questionnaire should cover these first 7: strategic, operational, business continuity, regulatory compliance, information security, financial and credit, and reputation. All vendors, regardless of the service they're providing you, would have some risks associated with it in those areas. You may also add in concentration risk, geopolitical risk, ESG, or environmental, social, and governance risk, and transactional risk, and we're going to look at each of those on the next 2 slides a little bit deeper. These next 2 slides will give you some examples for each of these risk domains. Of course, there's many other questions that could be asked, but we pulled out a few to provide just a selection for you. So for strategic risk, does the vendor or product align with our strategic goals? Operational, is sensitive data being accessed by this vendor? Will or does the vendor have unescorted physical access to the facilities? Business continuity risk, would a disruption in service cause a material impact to our organization or that of our clients? Regulatory and compliance, do we rely on this product or service in order to maintain compliance with any regulatory guidance? Is this a significantly regulated product? Reputation risk, does this product or service in any way impact our customers, and will they directly interact with our customers? And information security, is this a technology-related service that will in any way require integration with our network, and will or does this vendor have access to our network? And then continuing on, financial and credit risk, will or does this product or service require an expense of over X amount, whatever that X amount is for your organization? Does this product or service provide or support a significant revenue stream? For ESG risk, has the vendor conducted a baseline assessment of its emissions footprint, or does the vendor have a code of ethics? Geopolitical, is the vendor located in a region that's vulnerable to political unrest or human rights violations? Concentration risk, does the vendor provide multiple critical or high-risk products and or services. Are multiple critical or high-risk vendors located in the same geographic area? That one's really important as it relates to weather issues. And transactional risk, does the vendor process financial transactions on our behalf? Does the vendor have access to or process any payment data? Okay, once the vendor owner has completed the questionnaire that we just talked about, whether they did it in solo or they included collaborators across the organization, which is the best way to do it, then you can gather those results, those responses, and then determine the results. And then you want to read through any additional commentary that the vendor owner provided and ask for clarification if there are any, and verify that the risk assessment was performed on an individual product or service. And that's an important point to note here, because especially if you're working with vendors who provide a large number of products, and they're very different products, and you have more than one, each of those products or engagements with that vendor should be analyzed independently, because one may be critical and high risk where the other one is not critical and low risk. So you have to look at each of the engagements with the vendor independently. In this process, you are also going to be confirming the vendor's criticality, and every vendor should be classified as either critical or non-critical. And in our time of working with lots of different customers, we do see some challenges with that. But again, if you're following the financial services regulatory guidance around third-party risk management, there is a definite definition of criticality, and that is a critical vendor is one who, if a sudden loss of that vendor from an operational business failure would significantly disrupt your organization, or a sudden loss of that vendor would significantly impact your customers, or the time to restore service from the loss of that vendor would exceed 24 hours and would create a negative impact to your organization. So if you can answer yes to any of those, then that vendor is critical, regardless of the data that they have and regardless of the service they are providing you. Okay, so now we're ready to assign a risk rating, and as I mentioned, inherent risk is typically rated as low, moderate, or high, or some variation of that. And it's you who must determine how to assign those ratings based on the areas of information and the risks that your vendor owner identified. So this decision of assigning that inherent risk lies with you, the organization. What you'll find is that a single yes response under one of those risk domains that is extremely critical to your organization, depending on your risk appetite, could and should very likely predominate what the risk rating is, or the inherent risk rating is with that vendor. So just understand that there could be some questions that a single yes answer automatically makes it a high risk vendor. Also, as I just mentioned, you should be evaluating doing this risk assessment for all products that vendor is providing to you, because you could have a variety of risk-rated products from a single vendor. However, if one of those products rates as high, then the vendor should be rated and seen as a high-risk vendor. And then guess what? You need to repeat this periodically. It's not a one and done process. So the suggested cadence for risk reassessments is that critical or high risk vendors should be done annually. In some cases, you may choose to do that more often than annually. Your moderate risk vendors, say every 18 to 24 months, and your low risk vendors every 3 years, or maybe even at contract renewals. All of that to be determined at your organization. So knowing this is not a one and done process, here's some common ways in which you can monitor and manage that inherent risk. Again, doing periodic review and updates of that inherent risk assessment. Definitely with those critical and high risk vendors, that risk assessment process needs to be done at least annually. Some periodic vendor risk reviews to include review of vendor questionnaires. So again, those high-risk vendors should not or should be receiving, you should be sending them a questionnaire on a regular basis to get updated information. You also need to be collecting documents, updated due diligence documents from those high-risk vendors on an annual basis, or some more frequently than that, again, depending on the vendor. And those experts or your SMEs should be assessing those controls. Some other ways is regularly monitoring them through some various risk domains. So maybe you can find some monitoring data that you can use to help do a more frequent monitoring of certain really high risk or critical vendors. And then performance management, where you are truly sitting down and reviewing the overall performance of that vendor. Those are just some common ways to monitor it. So let's just close out this section by making sure we understand the role of due diligence in this process. Again, the purpose and the role of due diligence is to identify those potential risks and to determine and validate the vendor's controls around those risks. The process for due diligence typically involves requesting the due diligence information from the vendor. And remember, I said a moment ago that you would send them a questionnaire. So that's a great way to get this information, is through a questionnaire. Reviewing what is collected. Don't just get that questionnaire and the documents that they send you, but actually have that vendor owner engage the necessary subject matter experts to review what is collected. And by doing that, you're collaborating with those stakeholders, those subject matter experts and others who are involved with that vendor. Then you're going to determine if those residual risks are lowered after you've considered those vendor controls. That's the whole reason for gathering the documentation from the vendor. And then you're going to document your results and your findings, because you want to validate that this has been done, especially when examiners or auditors are in. You want to be able to prove that you went through this due diligence monitoring process of your high risk and critical vendors. And just to finish this up about due diligence, there's just some examples of some various due diligence documentation that you would gather and review. And I've mentioned a few of these already, but certainly financials, third-party audits, such as SOC audits, and others. There's many of them out there. Various policies, and there's could be lots of those as well. So I've just mentioned some that are most prominent, such as information security, incident management, privacy, and even HR. Certificates of insurance, W-9s, and again, there could be many other documents that you would want to request as you evaluate your vendor on a regular basis. And so now this is going to bring us to the second poll question.
Our second poll question of the day is, how does your organization conduct vendor due diligence? Based on the vendor owner's opinion or decision, based on the inherent risk, based on some other metrics, other or not sure? Kelly, I have another question here that we could go ahead and answer. And that question is, do vendor owners need to review all due diligence, or should this documentation be reviewed by others?
Yeah, it's highly unlikely that one person will have all of the knowledge and skill set and expertise necessary to review all of the various types of documentation and risk domains that are being evaluated. So what that means is you may have to outsource that task if you don't have that skill set in-house, or again, it becomes a collaborative effort across your organization. But no matter how you do it, it's important that the appropriate subject matter expert actually review the appropriate documentation associated with that particular risk domain, like financial risk, cyber risk, et cetera, so that you do get a thorough evaluation of that vendor's risk.
Okay, here are those results. Thanks again, everyone, for taking the time to answer the poll. Before continuing, I'd like to remind you that you can find our 6 steps of an inherent risk assessment on vendors infographic and sample questionnaire. Be sure to grab the handy resource. In addition to a helpful infographic, it does contain a sample questionnaire that you may find beneficial. Kelly, back to you.
So now we're going to turn our focus to residual risk. That's hard to say, residual risk. So the purpose of residual risk is to show the risk that remains after those controls have been applied. It also helps identify miscalculations. Residual risk should never be higher than inherent risk. So if it does turn out higher, then something is wrong. And it determines whether risk has been mitigated enough to that acceptable level that falls within your organization's risk appetite. Here are some tips for calculating residual risk. One, to determine that residual risk, again, you must complete that due diligence. Won't bore you again with that. The due diligence process evaluates, again, the vendor's risk management practices and controls to help you determine if they've been sufficiently mitigated. You are going to apply both internal controls that you have and external controls that your vendor has. And if the residual risk is greater or equal to the inherent risk, then you need to go back because something was wrong. It should never be greater than. But if it's equal to, you probably just want to take another look at the controls, make sure you didn't miss something. But even if the residual risk is acceptable at the end of that process, you still must continue identifying, assessing, monitoring, and managing that vendor's risk based on the inherent risk rating. That is a very critical thing to recall from here. So regardless of how you're able to mitigate that risk, you're going to monitor and review that vendor and assess that vendor based on its initial inherent risk rating. So on these next 4 slides, I am providing you a variety of question options that are residual risk questions. Unlike what I did a few slides ago, I'm not going to read these because there's more on these than on the inherent risk. So when you receive this PowerPoint following this webinar, then you'll be able to refer back to these. But here on this page, you'll see we've provided several examples for both strategic and operational risk. And let's look at the next few slides. This one's a pretty significant one because I've provided you an entire slide of potential residual risk questions for business continuity. Absolutely a hot topic, especially with your critical vendors, because you want to ensure that they're going to continue to do business since they are critical to your business. So here's a good list of example questions, residual risk questions. And then here's some example questions for regulatory and compliance, reputational risk, and information security risk. Financial and credit risk, ESG risk, geopolitical risk, concentration risk, and transactional risk. You can tell these are the ones that we have the hardest time finding some example questions on since there's only a few provided. So hopefully this will help, but I'm certain that you can find examples of these questions out there in a third-party risk management community or other locations. Let's look at the visual on the next 2 slides to demonstrate how we're getting to residual risk. What you're looking at in this case is a high-risk vendor where controls are not yet balancing out the high risk. So this vendor has a 24/7 operations. They have access to PII, we're processing payments, and they are also required to be licensed in the states where they do business. So what you're going to do is you're going to first identify those risks, then you need to mitigate those risks and find whether they are can be acceptable, that there are acceptable controls to treat them, or either they're unacceptable. And then once you treat them, you will know what the remaining or residual risk is that is established for that vendor. The point here is that the organization needs to know and decide if that planned treatment is sufficient. And note here also that you cannot eliminate all risk. That's just simply not possible. Therefore, there will be some level of risk that remains, and that, of course, needs to align with your organization's risk appetite. So let's take a look now at the controls that can counterbalance or treat those risks that we just looked at. So in this case, this vendor is PCI certified, so they meet the requirements to accept payments. They're also fully licensed and have a satisfactory SOC report. So in this case, the residual risk is lower than the inherent risk. And again, I want to point out about residual risk. It's not a rating, it's a measure of effective control. And why is this important? Because the purpose of residual risk is to find out whether the planned treatment is sufficient, whether those controls are sufficient. Or is your organization now comfortable with the level of risk that is remaining with this vendor? And that goes back to a statement I made earlier, and that is you will never eliminate all the risk. There will be some remaining risk that will exist with every vendor, and your organization has established a risk appetite. And so what is remaining needs to fall within that risk appetite. So this was just an illustration of that concept that I've now mentioned 2 or 3 times. A few final thoughts on how to use residual risk. Remember, there are risk ratings that indicate how confident your organization is in the control environment of your vendor. And they should never be used to determine the level of risk management, including the schedule of conducting risk reviews. Just as a quick reminder, that should always be determined by the inherent risks. So here's a good example. A bad driver may be safer in a car with airbags and seatbelts, but they don't improve the driver's abilities. That's just a kind of way of looking at what residual risk does not do to inherent risk. And just one more great visual on that thought, that residual risk rating should not be used instead of the inherent risk rating. Again, that vendor risk rating is indicating how confident you are in their controls. You still want to have that vendor engagement, that vendor product being monitored and evaluated as it relates to the inherent risk, because that is the natural risk that exists with that vendor. And so that is what should determine your contract terms, your level and frequency of risk evaluation, your performance monitoring, and all of that that goes along with that. Residual risk ratings helps your organization ensure that you don't become complacent and keep an eye on the risks that weren't addressed through controls. So again, the answer is no, you're not going to use residual risk to determine the ongoing monitoring of your vendor. Okay, we're going to look at 2 different residual risk scenarios to just kind of bring this all together. And this is the first one. And in this situation, here's an assumption that your inherent risk was high, and then after the due diligence is conducted, the residual risk is still high. In this situation, you should stop and review. You're going to want to do that to determine if you missed some controls. Maybe there's some different controls you should review to determine the risk, or determine if you want to continue to move forward with this vendor. And if you do, maybe there's some ways you're going to transfer some of that risk onto some financial liability or some other way to make your organization comfortable accepting that risk. In this example, you will see that your inherent risk was high, and after your review, you will see that the residual risk is moderate. So in this scenario, you're going to then establish the timing of your next risk review, which again is going to be based on that inherent risk rating, not the moderate, not the residual risk rating. And then you also want to remember that you're going to remain vigilant with this particular vendor, because it does have an inherent risk rating of high. So this residual risk rating of moderate now is giving you more comfort that those controls are good controls, and that you'll know to monitor those controls throughout the relationship to ensure they're still in place and haven't waned in that process, but maybe even strengthened in that process. Let's take a quick look at an example. You're considering the purchase of a new software which will host some sensitive data and facilitate a portion of your operations. The inherent risk is high, so you've taken the following steps. The vendor's SOC report has been reviewed and their level of security is approved. You've reviewed the penetration testing policies and results, as well as their remediation plans. And their business continuity plan has also been reviewed, and you begin to develop plans to incorporate the vendor services after those reviews that you've done. So you have decided in this situation that you can trust the vendor with the inherently high-risk service, which results in a lower residual risk. Again, there's no one-size-fits-all for the standard level when it comes to mitigating risk. Your organization must decide this for themselves. However, as a reminder, that residual risk will never be higher than the inherent risk. Just a simple example. So what happens next? Again, that risk profile is not fixed, and it needs to be monitored throughout the course of the relationship because we all live in an ever-changing environment. So you are going to do ongoing monitoring, and that can include various activities such as tracking service level agreements, doing those periodic risk assessments. Maybe you're going to be utilizing some monitoring tools to have a snapshot view of the vendor's controls and risk profile. That periodic risk assessment that I mentioned should be scheduled. It should be scheduled based on that inherent risk profile, not the residual risk profile. And then you certainly want to document and report on all of your information and data that you've gathered on that vendor and their risk profile throughout the life of the relationship. That's going to be a necessary step in your upcoming audits and evaluations. So now you have a boatload of risk to deal with, and so this slide shows you the 4 ways in which you will typically handle this risk, and we're going to talk about each of these further. 1 is to avoid it, 2 is to mitigate it, 3 is to transfer it, or 4 is to accept it. So the first one is just to avoid it. You've conducted the inherent risk assessment, and it's just not acceptable to your organization after you have determined the controls that the vendor has are not adequate enough. It's not within your risk tolerance. However, it might not be an option to just avoid it if you want to remain competitive. So maybe you need to go back and take a look at what are some things we could do to stay away from avoiding altogether. So you might ask yourself these questions. Do we need to send our entire customer file or just certain portions? Do we need to use email, or can we establish a secure VPN? Do we need to allow their personal access to our facilities or provide credentials? That's just an example. There could be other questions, but basically what we're saying is if you've decided that you need to avoid this relationship, but yet it's a competitive reason why you need to have this relationship, so then you need to probably take another look at what is it that you are providing and how can you better pull back some information that you're providing to that vendor. But at the end of the day, one option is to just avoid the risk. Of course, we can mitigate the risk, and we've been talking about that during this entire webinar. This is where we talk about looking at the controls that the vendor has in place to determine if they are appropriate to help reduce that risk. A control can be an action, a process, a strategy, or a task that it aims to prevent or detect. And here's 2 examples. One is a preventative control. These are intended to prevent bad things from happening, such as requiring authorizations, appropriation of separation of duties, or principle of least privilege, maintaining good physical security. Those are preventative controls. Then there's detective controls. These are essentially intended to catch or detect when something bad has happened. And you do that through access reviews, maybe reconciliations, audits, etc. In this part of mitigation, you're going to reach out to the vendors to get a feel for their internal policies, processes, procedures, and actually get those documents from them, validating that so that you understand the risks that are exposed to your organization. Mitigating risk is a shared responsibility between you and your vendor. So some things you want to consider internally are your contract terms. You want to make sure you have proper terms are in place around the risks that you identified. You want to have established some solid processes with how you're going to be working with that vendor, ensuring that there's appropriate approvals that are documented with how you're working with that vendor, and ensuring internal information security controls are considered, such as access management, encryption, etc. And you want to ensure that training is appropriate for, again, supporting that vendor. And from the vendor standpoint, the things they want to consider are you validating those vendor controls to you through the due diligence process. They, too, establish process and procedural expectations with how they're managing your data and your processes, determining if they have appropriate and adequate insurances in place, ensuring that proper training is conducted on their side as well, and if they have appropriate background and checks for the employees that's going to be supporting you and handling your customers' data, yours and your customers' data. So taking a deeper look at your vendor's controls, and let's just make sure we all have a good understanding of what we mean by a control. A control is a combination of people, processes, and tools that the vendor puts in place to prevent, detect, or correct issues caused by unwanted events. So some examples of your vendor's controls might be a dual authentication for system login, multi-factor authentication, some financial transaction reviewed by maybe two separate people that to avoid or prevent error, maybe some biometric screening to keep unauthorized persons out of sensitive workspaces. You would likely see that in server rooms, things like that. Annual compliance training. This is, pretty big, and testing to ensure that employees understand and abide by the regulations. And then geographically diverse data centers to prevent data loss in case of a natural disaster. So those are all examples of your vendor's controls. And some examples of your controls. Remember, you both have a part in this control environment. One is developing and testing a business continuity or disaster recovery plan that includes those critical vendors. Another is following the principle of least privilege in your organization so that your information security program is secure. Tracking vendor issues through some type of remediation process, and identifying and testing an exit strategy for critical and high-risk vendors. And that brings us to transferring the risk, and that's exactly as it sounds. You're not alleviating the risk necessarily, but you're transferring the financial or legal liability to your insurance carrier or to your vendor. For example, doing so by contract indemnification or ensuring adequate insurance policies are in place. And then the last one is to accept the risk. And accepting the risk should come as a last resort. As the point of risk management is to understand risk, this would be the techniques to use when there is risk that can't be mitigated. Remember that any and all unidentified and ignored risk are also accepted, especially in the eyes of an auditor. So a best practice in accepting risk would be to make sure there is a relatively formalized and documented process to evidence justification. So if you are accepting this risk, there needs to be valid reasoning why and good documentation as to that decision.
Our third and final poll question is, do you perform a risk assessment to determine both inherent and residual risk on vendors prior to signing a contract? Yes, always. Yes, depending on the spend with the vendor. Sometimes, depending on other factors. No, we don't perform a risk assessment prior to signing a contract, or not sure. Kelly, let's go ahead and answer another question from the audience. And this question is, what would be considered sufficient controls to attach for residual risk?
Well, there really could be a long list of them, so I'm just going to name a few that are well-known ones. First one that comes to mind is business continuity and disaster recovery plans, and the testing and results of those. You want both. So you want to see that they have a plan in place, but you also want to document and see that they have they're testing and getting results to you on an annual basis. A routine OFAC check on the vendor and then the primary owners of the business is also a good sufficient control. SOC audit reports and any other third-party audit reports that that particular vendor may have, risk domain questionnaires that were completed by the vendor, and of course financial statements and anything around the financial health of the organization. So those are just a few that are the most common ones I would recommend.
And here are those results. Thank you everyone for answering this question. Before we continue, I'd like to mention that in the related content widget, you can find What Are Inherent and Residual Third-Party Risk ebook available for download. Let's continue with the presentation. Back to you, Kelly.
And that brings us to our final message for today, and that's our key takeaways. And again, remember to answer the inherent risk questions internally. That's your responsibility to do that. Formalize and document your vendor risk assessment methodology and a third-party risk management policy. Keep good documentation. Be sure your metrics and data points are practical and reportable. I don't think I mentioned that throughout, but that's just something that always needs to be remembered. Even if you find residual risk are acceptable, you still need to monitor and manage the vendors based on that inherent risk rating. Please remember that from this webinar. And to determine the residual risk, you must complete due diligence, and the residual risk will never be higher than the inherent risk. Those are just a few final takeaways from this session. And I will turn it over to Jessie.
Great, thanks so much, Kelly. Before we dive into more questions and answers, I would like to thank everyone for attending. I would also like to thank Kelly for her time in sharing some important information. On your screen now, you will see our upcoming webinars. On September 24th, our How to Classify Who is a Critical Vendor webinar, and on October 1st through 3rd, our third-party risk management bootcamp. We hope you will be able to join us for those sessions. A link to register for those is in your copy of today's presentation slides. Let's now go ahead and answer some more questions that have come in during this session. Okay, Kelly, our next question is, who would be the best person to complete a risk assessment on a vendor? The vendor or the business owner or the project managers?
In most situations, the vendor owner, which could also be the product manager, or the person in the organization who manages the overall relationship with that vendor. So it could be called any number of things depending on the company. But that's really the person who knows the most about the vendor, knows the product and services that you're using, probably work the contract, probably involved with the performance monitoring of that customer. So that person in the organization should know the most about that vendor engagement and what it's supposed to do, the data that's shared. And so if you're in an organization where there is also a true third-party risk management manager who has the ultimate responsibility to make sure a risk assessment process and all the other third-party management processes are being done, then they would likely call on this vendor owner to be the person to complete the risk assessment. But it's also important to know that this is likely not a one-person job, because there's many people in the organization that are working with that vendor, either working with that vendor or has the skill set necessary to determine a true evaluation of the assessment of a vendor. So it should be a collaborative process with the appropriate players in your organization.
Great. Our next question. Is there a best practice for the number of residual risk questions that should be added per risk category or domain?
Not to my knowledge, there's not a set number. It's definitely easier to find and think of appropriate residual risk questions around the most common risk, risk like financial risk or cybersecurity risk. Then the more newer ones like ESG, for example, is still so new that we're still people are still, I think, finding their way with what it means to truly evaluate and mitigate ESG risk. So I don't think there's a best practice for a number, but if anyone on this webinar feels differently about that and can point to a place where there is a recommended set or count of residual risk questions per risk domain, would certainly like for that to be passed along to everyone.
Okay, next question here. Should you utilize the same risk assessment for all vendors?
Well, you shouldn't, but we know many that do because it simplifies the process. But vendor risk assessments should definitely be tailored to the vendor's unique characteristics. For example, if that particular vendor is performing some processes utilizing the newest technology out there called AI, then you certainly want to make sure that risk assessment is incorporating the AI processing, but not every vendor would have that. So I think that's a very clear example of why there should be some differences in the risk assessment that is done on the vendors. Some questions are going to be the same questions across regardless, because if all of your vendors are handling some kind of data, if they have some kind of access, then if system access or you have some kind of system access into it, there's going to be some common questions across them. But what we find, and actually what we also provide are templated risk assessment questionnaires of, I guess, various sizing, adding in those more complicated questions around more complicated functionality that you might have with a vendor. So that would be the ideal situation, is to have some set questionnaires built around some specific qualifications for that vendor and what they have access to and what they are doing for you.
Great. I think we have time for one more. Is it possible to have a low-risk vendor that is also critical to your organization?
It is, and actually a couple of good examples of that are your internet service providers and your phone companies. I mean, they're critical in the fact that, especially now with this, hybrid remote environment that most all of us are in, having both of those be always available is absolutely critical. But they're really low-risk vendors when you think about it from the standpoint of the data that they have access to, and honestly, how quickly you could stand up another one if you needed to. They are certainly essential, and they need to be considered as critical. And really and truly, what our experience is too with these types of vendors, they're generally, of course, the big daddies of the companies, and they're just not friendly with providing documentation. Whether they're providing it to a third party or they're providing it to you directly, just not something you can typically get to do much evaluation on them.
Great, thanks, Kelly. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have left for questions today. Thanks again, Kelly, for taking the time to address some of those that came in. Any questions we did not have time to answer today, we will address offline. We would like to thank you all for attending and hope you found today's session valuable. Another big thank you to Kelly for her time and content. You can ask even more questions inside of our third-party think tank, an online community that is dedicated to third-party risk professionals and free to join. Just because today's session has ended doesn't mean the conversations and questions must. Post your questions at thirdpartythinktank.com and see what your peers have to say. In the community, you'll find thousands of free educational resources, including ones related to vendor risk assessment. If you'd like to become a member of Third Party Think Tank, you can register on the site or shoot us an email, and we'll get you registered and send you a link to set your password. We did record today's session, and that recording link will be provided to you in a follow-up email that you will receive tomorrow afternoon. Also in the follow-up email will be the survey link for you to request the CPE credit. On behalf of VidMinder, it has been a pleasure. Thank you all and have a great rest of your day.